and welcome to this unique webinar, which is specially arranged for your people. And the topic of the webinar is Greenhouse Gas Protocol Corporate Standard and Measuring Carbon Footprint. I am Hamza bin Suhail from Carbon Matrix Academy. First of all, I will introduce my company, what services we are offering right now. We are offering GHG accounting, carbon markets mechanism, and energy efficiency in different domains and oil and gas and manufacturing sectors. Uh, we are also doing GHG accounting of oil and gas industry using API compendium guidelines, GHG protocol. I am also a lead verifier and validator of ISO 14064. We are also delivering training sessions on energy efficiency for motors, pumps, compressors, chillers, and boilers, uh, which are the basic mechanical components in the oil and gas and other textile and various industries. So we are also providing consultancy for the implementation of ISO 50001 energy system from the scratch. So being expertise in oil and gas sector and manufacturing industry, we are very much focused for GHG accounting using API compendium guidelines. And we are also providing customized training content to end users. We are also helping in sustainability reporting based on GRI standards. We have delivered a training session to the WWF Pakistan in which government agencies in textile industry and academia participated, and we conducted two sessions physically and virtually, and we trained over 300% on GHG using the GHG Protocol Corporate Standard. We also delivered a training session to the National Oil Marketing Company of Pakistan for energy efficiency, and this was really a great session, and we delivered fully a customized training content to the oil marketing company. This is my short introduction. I'm Hamza bin Suhail, and I'm GHG accounting expert and lead GHG verifier and validator. So I have vast experience in oil and gas under multiple domains, that is upstream, midstream, downstream, and manufacturing sectors. So we will cover the main topics of the GHG Protocol Corporate Standard, and we will try to cover these topics in 45 minutes, and last 15 minutes we will have a question and answer session. So in agenda, we will cover the science behind climate change, introduction, GHG accounting principles, organizational boundaries, operational boundaries, tracking emissions over time, calculating emissions, reporting mechanism, and at the end, question and answer session. So this presentation is not linked with the climate change science because this is a different topic, and this presentation is also not linked with the carbon markets. This is also a separate topic. This topic, the presentation is covering only the GHG protocol corporate for only for scope 1 emissions. We will start from the basics of the greenhouse effect and the climate change, the science and the climate change, as the solar radiation which come from the sun in the form of light, and when it collides with the surface of earth, some of the radiations absorbed and some of the reflected back in the form of infrared radiations. So this is a greenhouse effect, and this is a very this is a natural phenomena, and this is very necessary for the survival of life on the planet. But due to the enhanced greenhouse effect, due to the industrialization and deforestation, we surrounded by the greenhouse gases, and these infrared radiations are trapped by the greenhouse gases, and more the greenhouse increasing day by day, and we are seeing the global warming and the climate change phenomena. So the definition of a carbon footprint is a carbon footprint is the total greenhouse gas emission cause directly and indirectly. He can be an individual, it can be an organization, event, or product, and is expressed as a carbon dioxide equivalent. I will explain it in later what is carbon dioxide equivalent. So there are 7 greenhouse gases which are covered in Kyoto Protocol. One is CO2, methane, nitrous oxide, chlorofluorocarbon, hydrofluorocarbon, nitrogen trifluoride, and sulfur hexafluoride. So the figures which are mentioned on each gas is its global warming potential. CO2 has a global warming potential of 1, and the comparison made with the CO2, and methane is 25 times more as compared to CO2, and it's 265. Chlorofluorocarbon is 1300 times more potent, but it is banned on the world due to its ozone depletion mechanism. But the hydrofluorocarbon, which is used nowadays in AC and refrigeration system, but it has a more global warming potential as compared to the chlorofluorocarbon. And nitrogen trifluoride, this gas is mostly used in electronic industry, and sulfur fluoride. This is used in substations, in electrical installations. It is used, I think, it is used instead of a vacuum cycle. Sulfur fluoride is used, and it has the largest global warming potential. So this is the Greenhouse Protocol reporting framework, agnostic. Greenhouse Gas Protocol established in 1998 by World Resource Institute and World Business Council Sustainable Development, and it is partnered with businesses, NGOs, and governments. The aim to establish this standard was to present a standardized method for the GHG accounting and reporting. So this is a standardized approach, and this standard is being used by many multinational companies, and it is a very technical standard and easy to understand. But this standard has a very good relation with other standards of GHG accounting and reporting and the frameworks. First of all, I will tell you about the difference between the standard and the framework. Standards present the specific guidelines, specific standards, and the framework those standards for their own guidelines. So greenhouse gas protocol exists between these two the overlapping portion between these two circles. So greenhouse gas standard is a very friendly standard, that it is used by any other standard, that is GRI Global Reporting Initiative, and the other frameworks, that is CDP, carbon GHG protocol is very and it can be used with all the other standards and all other frameworks. GHG protocol has also published their standard, that is scope 2 guidance. The next webinar we will present about the scope 2 guidance. And you change standard scope 3 value in standard and scope 2 guidance. There is another standard, that is the project GHG emission standard and product life cycle mitigation standard, and there is a list of standards. So you can see, I have mentioned the web link here, GHG Protocol website. You can see all rest of the standards there. Before starting the GHG accounting, there are 5 principles of GHG accounting, and these GHG accounting principles have been derived from the basic accounting principles, that is relevance, completeness, consistency, transparency, and accuracy. So the first principle is relevance. The relevance principle, the meaning of the relevance principle is that your GHG accounting report should be like that. It should help decision makers, and it must fulfill the intended outcome of the relevant stakeholders. Okay, so if you are working in an oil refinery, and the intending stakeholders are looking for the largest emissions from the distillation towers and all other crude oil heats and power plants, and you are only reporting the emissions, the VOCs emissions from the storage tanks, and you are not reporting rest of the emission sources which are the largest contributor, then you are not fulfilling the relevance requirement. So your emission inventory should follow the relevance. Second principle is completeness. Is an example of the largest automobile company, Volkswagen. They started to report their emission inventories in 2006, and in 2006 you can see from the graph, in 2006 their process emissions was very small. You can see the gray portion in the 2006 pie chart, and in 2012 their process emissions was very large due to the changing in process. So if they stop to report the process emissions in 2006, they would be unable to report the largest portion which was produced in 2012. So completeness principle tells us that we should report our complete inventory. We should not leave any small or large emissions. We should report all the emissions which are covered under our operational scope. Third principle is consistency. Consistency means that if we report in for example, we use the for the stationary combustion, we use the default emission factor. Then in 2007, we will also use default emission factor. Then because there should be a consistency in this calculation methodology, in 2007 calculation methodology. Calculation methodology, then 2006 inventory will also be changed. So a meaningful comparison can be made. Okay. And the fourth principle is transparency. Transparency means what you are supposing during your calculation, what you are putting in your calculation sheet, you should be transparent and you know about your assumptions and all other calculation methods. And number five is accuracy. You should be accurate to develop your inventories. So you cannot calculate your emissions by using the default emission factor US EPA. You can use, but if you are available with the relevant and the most accurate data, you should go for that data instead of using only the easily available data and you calculate your emissions. You should be more accurate in your emissions inventory. Then there is the concept of organizational boundaries. When first of all, you will need to understand the GHG accounting principles. In my 2 days training module, I explained it in a very much detail and in a more better way, and by giving a few examples of each principle, as I just told you by giving small examples of each principle. But in my training, I have expressed it in a more detailed way. Then there is the concept of organizational boundaries. Organizational boundaries determine which parts of the company are included in the inventory and at what percentage. I will give you an example. A couple of years ago, Pakistan started to drilling in an offshore site. Okay, and there are four companies at that time. One is the Pakistan leading oil and gas company OGDCL, and the other is PPL, Pakistan Petroleum Limited. Both have 25 and 25% share. Rest of the 50% share, 25% share was with ExxonMobil and 25% share was with ENI. So when they started to report their GHG emissions, first of all, they will have to decide whether we should report their emissions on the basis of equity share or on the basis of the operational control. The operator of that operation was ENI. If they decide that we will report our emissions on the basis of operational control, then if they emit 100 tons of CO2, then 100 tons of CO2 emission will be will go into the account of CI. If they agreed to report their emissions on the basis of equity share approach, because four of the companies have contributed 25% share, 25% share, then all four companies will count for their GHG emissions, that is 25 tons, 25 tons, four of the companies. So you will have to decide whether you will go for your GHG emissions accounting on the basis of equity share approach, or on the basis of financial control or operational. So organizational boundaries can be based on equity share and or control consolidation approach. Under the control consolidation approach, there are two approaches. One is operational control and another is financial control. In financial or operational control, whether you put your emissions 100% or 0%, there is no in between. But in equity approach, you on the basis of share you have for that particular company. Then total emissions accounted can vary significantly depending on consolidation. For example, have 50-50% share, and they decide that, and they emit 100 tons of CO2, and they decide we will on the basis of equity share. 50-50 tons will be accounted for their GHG emission. If one of the company is the operator of that, then it account for 100 CO2. So based on the approach to decide the organizational boundary, your total emission vary significantly. And companies can use both approaches to get a more assessment of their emissions. This is a very tricky point. You will not use two approaches to report the GHG emissions, but to get the idea that how much you are contributing, you can use both approaches. But when you will officially report those emissions, publicly report or externally report, you will only use one approach. And the next thing is operational boundaries. After the organizational boundaries, there are operational boundaries. Operational boundaries determine which emissions are included and how they are classified. Number one, scope 1 emissions, scope 2 emission, and scope 3 emissions. There are generally two nomenclatures which are used for the operational boundaries, that is scope 1, scope 2, and scope 3. The other nomenclature is direct emissions, energy indirect emissions, or all other indirect. In ISO 14064, the ISO standard for the GHG emissions reporting and verification and validation, the nomenclature which has been used there is direct emissions, energy indirect emissions, and all other indirect emissions. And in GHG protocol, the nomenclature which is being used is scope 1, scope 2, and scope 3. And selected consolidation approach to leased assets, outsourced activities, or franchises. There are also the assets which are owned by the company, and there are also the assets which are leased by the company. Some buildings have been leased. So there are two types of lease. One is financial lease and the other is operating lease. And if the lessor which leased his building or his asset, if he is the control that asset, then he will report those emissions. And the leasee, which is a basically a rented party, will report emissions as their scope 3 emissions. And if the lessor is not controlling the emissions from being double counted. Okay, the example of this that the scopes prevent emissions double counted as if the power plant is producing 100 tons of CO2 against the 5,000 kilowatt hours, then the company which is purchasing that energy will account for those emissions in scope 2 emission, but the power plant will account for those emissions in its scope 1 emission. So scopes prevent two companies from being double. You can do counting in different scope, but under the same you cannot do double counting. scope 3 emissions, there is a complex methodology. Here, scope 3 emissions can be counted the same scope, but in scope 1 and scope 2, you cannot do double counting under the same scope. So here is a summary of scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions. Emissions, direct emissions, scope 1 emissions are reporting organizations' direct GHG emissions. Indirect, there are two options in indirect. One is energy indirect, another is all indirect. In scope 2 are reporting organizations' emissions associated with the generation of electricity, heating, cooling, or steam purchase for own consumption. And scope 3 are reporting organizations' indirect emissions other than those covered in scope 2. So scope 2 is specifically concerned with energy related emissions, and scope 3 there are upstream emissions and downstream emissions. Scope emissions, direct GHG emissions from sources a company owns or control. Example, generation of electricity, heat or steam. Some companies, some refineries have their own power plant or their own gas turbines or steam turbines. They are producing their own electricity and known as captive power plant. So those emissions will come under the scope 1 emission. If they have their own boilers and they are producing steam, then those emissions will also come under scope 1 emission. If we are purchasing that steam or electricity from outside party or any other sister company, then those emissions will come under scope 2 emissions. The other is physical or chemical processing. In oil and gas, there are a lot of emissions. If a company who is processing the natural gas which is coming from the well, and only need the methane content, but it is not only the methane content which come from the earth. There are also CO2. I have worked in a gas processing plant where the gas composition was 40% CO2. So that 40% CO2 was not of any use. So we emit that CO2 through incinerator without processing. So that emissions which result through the processing, so that come under the processing emission. It is not producing through as a result of any combustion. Then transportation of materials, products, waste and employees. If transportation or the vehicles are owned by the company, and the fugitive emissions, leaks and other irregular releases of gases or vapors, the air conditioners which are installed in every office, in every building, and and in 1 or 2 years we need to refill the coolant in the ACs. Then the leaked coolant was the GHG, that is hydrofluorocarbons, which has the largest global warming potential. And how will we determine the scope of emissions? Determined by ownership or control of emission or source, not determined by type of emission source. It is a very good statement that ownership is linked with the emission or source, not linked with the type of emission. Okay, if the stationary combustion, we cannot decide that every time the stationary combustion will come under the scope 1 or come under the scope 2. If you are owning the asset, then it will come only under the scope 1. If you are not owning the asset, it will come under scope 2 or scope 3. And what does ownership or control of the emission source mean? An organization could legally own the source of the emissions, and an organization could lease the source of emissions. So I was studying the document which is developed by the European Union, and they have mentioned in their Excel sheet that when you will report the GHG emissions, you will also mention the latitude and longitude of the emission source, which will also show the legal ownership of the emission source. This is one of the way. If an entity leases an item, it also controls the right to use the asset for the period of the lease. Okay, I already told you. Captured within scope 1 due to booked as right of use asset in balance sheet. If you have leased one of your asset, but if you have control for that asset, it will be shown in your financial balance sheet. It will be reflected as asset. What about double counting? Emissions will be double counting in scope 1 and scope 2. However, no double counting within the same scope. It must be clear in everyone's mind that emissions can be double counted between scope 1 and scope 2. Scopes across the value chain. Upstream scope emission, material acquisition and pre-processing, and scope 1 and scope 2 emissions are linked with the production, and downstream scope 3 emission, distribution and storage, use, end of life, and your waste, which is going outside your facility and it is being by some contracting company, then it will also come under downstream scope 3 emissions. There are 15 categories of scope 3 emissions which is mentioned in the GHG Protocol Scope 3 standard, value chain standard, but in ISO 14064, it's 6 categories, and only 4 categories are linked with the Scope 3, and rest of 2 categories are linked with the Scope 1 and Scope 2. So when we do the ISO 164 course, there is an exercise that we do map 15 categories under the 4 categories which are allocated for the scope 3 emissions. Then there is a next concept that is tracking emissions over time. And this concept has been by the GHG protocol because you need to compare the emissions against some particular or some base year. The is that if you want to lose your weight, you will have to make a baseline that if your weight is 100 kg and you need to reduce it up to the 60 kg, then there is you will every time compare your weight against the 100 kg. You will not compare your weight against 90 kg or 80 kg. You will use your use the weight 100 kg when you started your journey. So base year concept is similar, that when you started your reporting your emissions, or base year is also can be a year when we have the when you have the maximum data for the emissions calculation. It is up to you how you will decide the base year. The two basic approaches to select the base year is that one, it should be the oldest year, and the other is you have the maximum data for the GHG emissions, and you should select on the basis of these 2 categories, one the oldest and the other is maximum. So next is define your organization's recalculation policy, and the example of the recalculation is that if this year was 2020 and in 2022 you acquired another unit which is owned by another company and you acquired from them, so you need to recalculate your base year and you will have to incorporate the acquired emissions in your base year emissions, so a meaningful comparison can be made. If you if the base year of your company was 2020 and you are calculating your emissions in 2022, and in 2022 you divest one of your unit, yeah, divest mean you sold your one of the unit, then you will have to minus your emissions in 2020 base year emissions, so a meaningful comparison can be made. So a recalculation policy should be in your organization when you will recalculate your base year emissions, and base year emissions can also be recalculated if some of your calculation method has been changed over the years. And you will have also to decide about the significance threshold to trigger base year recalculation. So most of the organization use 5% of threshold to trigger base year recalculation. If the difference is more than 5, then there is a crossing of threshold limit. So you will also you will have also to decide about the threshold limit in your recalculation policy. and you will recalculate for structural changes. As I have already told, you can acquire the unit, and you can also divest your one of the unit. And changes in calculation methodology, if you are using the emission factor based on the calorific value, and the other year you started your emission by using the calculation methodology, that is continuous monitoring system. So the calculation methodology was changed, so you will have to change your base year calculation. And if you discovered significant errors, then you will also have to recalculate your base year so that meaningful comparison can be made. Don't recalculate for organic growth or decline. It's mean if you are producing 100 units product in 2020, and in 2022 you are producing 200 units, then you will not recalculate for a base year, because your organic growth occurred or decline occurred. You did not acquire and divert any asset. And changes involving facilities that do not exist in base year. For example, your base year was 2020, and you are calculating your emissions in 2022, and you acquired a unit, but that unit does not exist in your base year. You mean it's example that the unit functional in 2021, from where you acquired that it was came into existence in 2021. There will be no need to recalculate your base year. And the other thing is out and in sourcing activities previously accounted for in different scope. For example, in 2020, you have your own vehicles which use for the pick and drop of employees, and in 2022, you outsource the pick and drop activity. So you will not recalculate your base year, because those emissions will come under scope 3, and in 2020 these emissions were calculating in scope 1 emissions or direct emissions. So you will have to be very careful about the recalculation of base year and tracking emissions. Detailed module, there are exercises of organizational boundaries, operational boundaries, and track emissions. When one of the individual do some that comprehensive exercise, he's able to fully understand the concept of tracking emissions over time, organizational boundaries, operational boundaries. This training webinar, a very basic webinar for the GHG calculation and accounting. So anyone who wants to pursue his career, or who wants to master himself or herself for the GHG accounting, must be firstly he must be equipped with the basic concepts of GHG accounting. So this is a very basic webinar, and in the detailed training module, there are very comprehensive against each topic. And the next thing is identifying and calculating emissions. First of all, you complied with the GHG accounting principles. Then you decided about the organizational boundaries, and then you decided about the operational boundaries, and then you decided about the base year, which will be your base year, and you understand all the. Then there is the main thing which I think you people are attending this session to understand about the calculation of emissions. So in calculation of emissions, there are 5 steps. See each step one by one. Number 1 is identify source of emissions. Identify sources of emissions. This is the step number. Sources of emissions can be stationary combustion, mobile combustion, fugitive emissions, process emissions from physical or chemical processes. Number 1 is stationary combustion. Combustion of fuels in stationary sources. Examples can be boilers, furnaces, turbines, heaters, common barbecue generators. Stationary combustion, you need 2 types of data. One is primary data. If you have the primary data, then well and good. the primary data is the most accurate data, in which you need the type of fuel and the quantity of fuel. And if you have primary data, then you will use the secondary data, and it is the estimated data. We can understand this one example, that if you are using a boiler and you have no flow meter for the fuel, okay, that is how much fuel you are using, then you will have to see that the amount which you have paid for to procure the fuel, you will see that you will estimate the consumption of fuel by the consumption of your dollars. The type of fuel, you know, if it is natural gas or it is fuel oil or it is coal, because depending upon the fuel type, your emission factor will be changed. The next thing is mobile combustion. Mobile assets under the control of the company combust fuel when being used. Fuel burn during transportation, examples trucks, trains, ships, aeroplanes, and cars. When you will attend a detailed training session, then there is a very much detail about the mobile combustion. As you people know that there are no electric vehicles, and there are also the vehicles which are partially on the fossil fuel and partially on the batteries, and vehicles which are 100% on fossil fuels, and the vehicle are 100% on battery. So there is a very much detail about the mobile combustion too. So same concept is, if you are calculating the mobile combustion or the vehicular emissions, primary data, and other one is also a secondary data, then you will also try to collect the data based on the primary data, that is the quantity of fuel combusted for each fuel type. If you are not providing with the primary, then you can use the secondary data used for estimation, that is the amount spent on fuel. And the other thing is vehicle model and year. The older model have lesser engine efficiency as compared to the latest model, and the type of fuel you distance traveled. One thing you need to remember, that the CO2 is based on the type of fuel, but the N2O and methane emissions from the vehicle as a source depend upon the distance traveled and the vehicle model and the year. So more distance traveled, your methane and two emissions will vary as the distance, or the CO2 emissions. Fugitive emissions are intentional, unintentional releases, the forgotten emissions, because often not intentionally released. It can be if your plant has an aging, or your infrastructure is very old, or your maintenance is not up to the mark, and your preventive maintenance of pumps is not up to the mark. There is a leakage in the pump seals or the gasket, which is between flanges, then there will be a leakage. That emissions can be categorized into the fugitive emissions. And often you can see, and it is very common in refrigeration and air conditioning equipment. As maintenance personnel refill your AC's gas, then there happen a fugitive emission due to the leakage of hydrofluorocarbons. The examples are equipment leaks, cooling towers, methane from natural gas pipes, there is a leakage of methane gas. When you are calculating fugitive emissions, then there are 4 steps in calculating the fugitive emissions. Number one is determine the number and types of refrigeration and air conditioning equipment, including the types of refrigerants used and total refrigerant capacity of each piece of equipment. Step number two, identify any new equipment that was installed during the reporting period and was charged on site. Step number three, estimate emissions from known leaks during the operation of the equipment. The maintenance team may record this information. As you people all of know that you cannot predict, or you cannot measure the coolant through air conditioning and refrigeration equipment, then you will have to collect data from the maintenance team that how much you have filled the gas. The amount of gas which was filled by the maintenance was equal to the amount of gas which was leaked. So this is the estimation of the leakage of the coolant. You can estimate in this way. And step number 4, identify any pieces of equipment that were disposed of during the reporting period and calculate the disposal. You dispose of the refrigeration equipment, then there are also possibility of emission of leakage coolant. So you will also have to see the disposal mechanism of refrigeration equipment. And I have already told you about chemical processing, manufacturing or processing of chemicals and materials, for example, cement, aluminum, and waste processing. There are processing emissions, which is more in the chemical or processing industry. So when you are calculating the scope 1 emissions, firstly you need to use the primary data. If there is no primary data, you can use the secondary data. If the secondary data is not available, then you can use the tertiary data. If tertiary data is not available, then you will use the estimation method. And in a similar case, in a mobile combustion, you will see the primary, secondary, tertiary, and then the estimation, and same with the case of the fugitive emissions. Now, there are basically 4 calculation approaches for the stationary combustion. These approaches have been divided into 4 tiers. One is tier the calculation or the inventory of Pakistan, which was developed in 1994 by using the tier 1 approach. The tier 1 approach is that you only know the activity data. Activity data means you know how much you have consumed the fuel, and you use the default emission factor, that is US EPA emission factor, and you multiply the activity data with the emission factor, and you got the GHG emissions results. Okay, but there is another tier 2 approach which is more accurate as compared to tier 1 approach, in which you use the emission factor based on the calorific value. In US EPA emission guidelines, there are types of fuel, and the respective calorific values have been given. And again, those calorific values, there are emission factors. So if you are using oil or gas, you will see the calorific value of the natural gas through gas chromatograph, and you will get one specific calorific value. And against that calorific value, you will see on the literature that which emission factor will be used against that particular calorific value. This is a tier 2 approach, and which is more accurate as compared to the tier 1 approach. And the calorific value for gas is determined by the gas chromatograph, and for the oil, I think a bomb calorimeter is used. And the tier 3 approach is that you use the mass balance approach, that is stoichiometric calculation. You know which elements are entering and which elements are leaving the system. So stoichiometric calculation is used only for the CO2 emissions mainly, because from the stationary combustion there is a 99% of emission consisting of CO2 emission, and less than 1% of emission based on methane and the because the nitrogen is very less in the fuel. So stoichiometric calculation, detailed training module, there are very comprehensive exercises of GHG emissions using the stoichiometric calculation and using the calorific value. And the fourth one, that is tier 4 approach, and that is the most accurate approach, that is continuous emission monitoring system, in which you have a boiler or you have a furnace, and there is a flow meter on your stack calculating the flow of flue gases or air which is coming outside the chimney. And you have also a flue analyzer which detects the flue gas in milligram per meter or gram per cubic meter. When you multiply the flow of the gas, which is cubic meter per day, and multiply the flow with the concentration of the GHG gas, that is milligram per liter or gram per cubic meter, then after the cancellation of unit, you will get the result in tons per day. So this is the most. So in continuous emission monitoring system, there are two subsystems from which you can calculate the GHG emissions in tons per day. One is the detect gas through a flue gas analyzer, and there is an installation of emission monitoring system, that is the flow meter, which tells the flow of flue gas. And the other thing is through the indirect, that is oxygen analyzer. Uh, in an oxygen analyzer, you will get the result excess oxygen, that is 5%, 3%, 4%, and you will have the stoichiometric calculation, that is this much quantity of gas is required for the this much quantity of fuel to burn. So when you will get the excess oxygen, you will put that excess oxygen value in the stoichiometric calculation, and you will come to know the CO2 in tons per day, and you will multiply that value with the number of operating hours or number of, then you will get the result for the whole year. So there are two methods under the continuous emission monitoring system. So in the trail training module, there is an example of also a continuous emission monitoring system. And the estimation most common approach, multiply activity data by appropriate emission factor, example fuel use records. This is a simple demonstration to calculate the GHG emissions. You multiply the activity data with the emission factor and you get the tons of emissions. And here comes a concept of global warming potential, because you know that there are GHG greenhouse gases, that is carbon dioxide, N2O, and methane, and you get three values, one for CO2 and one for methane and one for N2O. You cannot add into Apple. So you will have you need to have a consistent unit. So that is why the global warming potential concept come into effect, that you multiply the global warming potential with the tons of emission, and you get the value in carbon dioxide equivalent to have a meaningful common unit, and the common is in carbon dioxide equivalent. In carbon dioxide equivalent, there are also N2 and methane is have been merged into a single common unit, because you cannot do Apple. Activity data multiplied by emission factor is equal to tons of emission, and tons of emission multiplied by global warming potential is equal to CO2 equivalent emission. So calculation approaches most should consider these records for scope 1 emissions, purchase records of fuel, or the metered flow meter, which is normally installed for the to track the consumption of fuel. And for scope 2 emissions, metered electricity consumption record. For scope 3 emissions, activity data such as fuel use, passenger miles, etc. The biggest challenge to calculate the scope 3 emissions is that to collect, because the scope 3 at the downstream side. So both these sides, that is the upstream and downstream, are not in your control. So the most the difficult component of the scope 3 emissions is the data collection, because you will have to collect data from the raw material addition to its your destination. You have to track. For example, if you are using diesel in your burning mechanism, you will go for the extraction of crude oil and the refining of crude oil, and then the diesel extraction during the registration process, and that diesel which is traveled through vehicles, and vehicle emit the emissions during the transfer of diesel. So this is a very long chain. So the biggest challenge in calculation of scope 3 emissions is collection of the data. And for the sector specific guidelines, you can visit the GHG protocol. There are a few sector specific guidelines, for example, cement sector, aluminum sector, nitric acid sector, industry associations and government agencies. You can visit the website and you can get the sector specific guidelines. For example, oil and gas sector, there are guidelines for oil and gas, API, GHG, NTM guidelines. And the emission factor convert activity data to emission values, and it is published by various entities, including government agencies, intergovernmental organizations, printed in specific units, and make sure units must match and use most recent available while maintaining consistency. And sources of emission factor can be GHG protocol, IPCC, which is the biggest institution for the scientific study of climate change, that is Intergovernmental Panel of Climate Change, government agencies, the CDP, the Framework for Carbon Disclosure Project, other software providers, for example, Gabi, SIMA. These are the softwares and sector-specific sources: BCST, Sustainable Cement Initiative, International Petroleum Industry, International Aluminum Institute. So GWP values can be seen from the IPCC assessment reports. So this is a table where assessment report number 4, which came into effect in 2007, and assessment 5, and the latest assessment report 2021. And global warming potential has been categorized over 100 time period or over a 20-year time period. So there is a value for the methane is 9.8 for fossil origin. It means that during the 100 time period, if methane remains 100 years in the air, then it will have 29.8 times more effect as compared to the CO2. Or if we talk about the 20-year time period, it has 82.5 times more impact in 20 years of time period as compared to the CO2. So this is the concept which you need to understand. There are calculation tools which you can use. You can use the calculation tools, and these are very simple tools which are mentioned and which have been given in GHG protocol website. During my training workshop, I all the candidates that please bring the laptops, and we practice 2 or 3 exercises by those GHG calculation tools. And step number 5, roll up to corporate level. So first of all, you will identify the source of emissions. Number 2, you will select the calculation approach, as I have already told you the 4-tier approaches. And the number 3 is the collect data and choose emission factor, and you will have to use the latest emission factor. Okay. And number 4 is apply calculation tools, and number 5, roll up data to the corporate level. So when you GHG emissions, you will follow the 5 principles. As I have already told you that this is the basic, and these are the basic principles of reporting. You will have to follow it at each step of GHG calculation. One is relevance, completeness, consistency, transparency, and accuracy. Now, then you will have to decide whether you are reporting only for scope 1, scope 2, or scope 3. So mostly organizations are reporting scope 1 and scope 2, but there is an optional reporting for scope 3 emission, and you can also report for your performance. If you have implemented the energy related projects and you reduced your GHG emission, you can also report that performance, and you can also explain about the offsets. If you have a source purchase some of the carbon credits, you can also mention in your GHG accounting report. But this is a very separate topic about the carbon markets offsets. and there is a separate guideline for GHG protocol, that is GHG emissions for project standard. And for if we talk about the ISO, then there is a that is ISO 15064 part 2. If you are participating in a GHG program, check its reporting requirements. For example, if you are participating in a CDP carbon disclosure project, then you will have to customize your GHG reporting according to those requirements, or if you are participating through GRI mechanism. And you should interpret your emission ratio indicators. For example, if you are refining the 1,000 barrels of crude oil in 2023 and you are emitting 500 tons of CO2, and if you are processing 500 barrels of CO2 in 2024 and you are emitting only 300 CO2 of emissions, so you will not just you cannot say that I have reduced my emissions. You will have to present or report your emissions any unit identity by using the ratio indicator, so a meaningful comparison can be made. So for detailed training, which we are going to conduct after a month, you can email us at hash2018@gmail.com, or you can call plus 93364116 So our team will contact with you, and for that organized and particular training, please visit our page Carbon Matrix Academy on LinkedIn. So announcement can be made at the earliest of the training. For it will be a 2 days training session online, and there are a multiple exercises for that particular training. Thank you. Any questions? So Jawal, please unmute the mic of the candidates if they want to ask any question.
Left me. Yes,
We
I
have
have
10 minutes
unmuted
for the
you.
question answer session.
Hello.
Yes, yes.
Sir, I am from Lamagbola Province, Islamabad. I want to ask you about the stoichiometric calculation trainings.
Uh, about the mitigation standard training you are asking about.
Stoichiometric, the stoichiometrics training. Stoichiometric
So,
calculation training, sir.
so no,
Kashyap,
okay, a stoichiometric calculation. You are talking about the
Yes, sir.
stoichiometric calculation. Okay.
Yes, sir.
When I will deliver a 2 days training session after a month, then a stoichiometric calculation exercise will be a part of that training.
Okay, sir. Thank you.
Any other question? Any other question? If there is no question, we can wind up the session. Shehzad Zahoor is asking that slides does not show. Slides, what about the screen sharing? Can anyone confirm if there is any other problem, if the same problems face any other person?
No, sir.
Okay. Okay. So you can submit your feedback to our media manager and the lead facilitator if you have any query or any question. So hopefully we will meet during the training session, and for the training session, details will be presented at our LinkedIn page, Carbon Matrix Academy. So take care, all of you. Thank you very much for joining this session. And goodbye.